I knew I was looking forward to coming today, but to hear love mentioned so many times in the first 10 minutes is just wonderful. I do think we need to talk about love more in businesses and in work. So that's my declaration. So that's great. Okay, so what is culture? We talk about it a lot, we declare it. I started my experience with the tool I use now as a client. My chief exec wanted me to do something about our culture, and I said, what do you want me to do? And she went, I don't know, I just want you to do something. I said, well, what's wrong with the culture we've got? I don't know, it's just not good enough. I said, well, what does a good culture look like? She went, I don't know, go and find out. So I went and found out, and I've had a very interesting journey over the last 14 years. What is it? Most of us will say it's the way we do things around here. Well, that's okay. It's not very descriptive, though. If I think we do things differently to somebody else, it's hard to be tangible with that definition. It's certainly what we do when we think nobody is looking. It's the real thing that we do when we're under pressure, when the context gets difficult, when times get tough. What do we revert to? Sometimes our darkest selves, our most defended self, and maybe our most glorious self. So it's what do we do consistently when we're not trying to be at our best? It's the visible and the invisible. It's your strategy that's on a page, sometimes not so gloriously as on one page. It's often many pages. It's your policies in your folder. It's what you have on the walls. It's what your parking looks like. It's all those external, how big are your offices, who gets the big offices, and how thick's the carpet. Okay, they're all signs of your culture. What we want to really look at when we measure culture is what's the deeper level? What are people really believing and assuming to be true? So what are the unwritten rules that aren't on any walls or in any policy document? What are the relationships like in this company? What's the attitudes? How important is status? And who gets to recognize it? So what are the values? What are the norms? And what's the fundamental sense of safety? So when we do our diagnostic, we're digging deeper into that sense of beliefs and assumptions. It's also, it's a kind of a deficit definition, but I would always say this to my clients. It is reflected in the worst behavior you are prepared to accept. So if you're not prepared to do anything about some of the toxic behaviors that you might have in your company, and I love the fact that you were really clear, toxic people have to go, then don't start this journey on exploring your culture, because you'll just breed more cynicism. Whenever I show that to a leadership team, there's always a kind of wry smile. And then my next question is, are you all thinking about the same person? And generally they are. Okay, is anybody brave enough to say who that person is? No. Okay, so we have to get real and we have to get true and we have to be brave and courageous. So here's the model. I was thinking, oh wow, if these slides don't come up, talking about culture in 12 minutes is difficult enough. Doing it without any visuals would have been really challenging. So here's our model. It's evidence-based. Dan Denison did his PhD 30 years ago, and his research question was, what is it about an organization's culture that can be correlated to measurable performance indicators? Okay, so he said companies have to manage two fundamental continuums. They have to be really clear on their external focus. Why the hell are they in business in the first place, and which market are they in business to do? They also have to keep an equal focus on their people and their systems and processes. They have to be stable and reliable enough and predictable enough in how they do business to guarantee a sense of quality and consistency, whilst ready to flex and change if the market dictates, we get hit by COVID, or if people innovate, as we've just heard beautifully. So when external focus meets the need for stability, we talk about the mission. What's the higher purpose? How do the strategic priorities connect back to that higher purpose? How do the short-term goals and objectives connect back to the strategic priorities to achieve the higher purpose? The opposite of external to stable is internal to flexible. Now we're saying, yes, but are we bringing our people with us? Do they really understand what that means for them? It's a reasonable question. What's in it for me? What am I going to get from this? Will I be inspired by the purpose? Will I be developed as a more capable person? So there's a dynamic tension that gets involved here. If we stay on the flexible side, but go back to reminding us that we have to look beyond the company too, we talk about the adaptability piece. How are we picking up the patterns and the trends in the market? How well do we listen to our customers? What do we do with that customer understanding into the decisions that we make? When we're going to listen to our customers, we need to make change. Are we resistant to that change? Are we change addicts? Do we connect that change back to the strategic priorities because that's what will achieve our purpose? When we do make a change, do we succeed and do we fail? In my experience, most companies ignore success because they're too busy getting on to the next project. They might just take a moment to reflect if something hasn't worked well. Well, if we were doing more appreciative inquiry, we may be focusing more on our successes and working out why that succeeded so well. That brings a second dynamic tension because we're back to stable and internal now, and now we're saying, yes, but are we siloed? Or are we really horizontally wise? Do we think about the unintended consequences if we're going to make different changes across the business? How do we handle conflict and agreement? How do we have those really difficult conversations? How do we celebrate the diversity of thought? And finally, the most sensitive point of the model for us in Europe is, what are our guiding principles? Do we have leaders and managers that practice what they preach? Or do we have a consistent set of values? And more importantly, do we hold people to account if they don't behave accordingly to them? I've seen lots of core values on the wall. I've asked lots of leadership teams, okay, just write your core values on a post-it note for me. That is quite a challenge, which is quite a thing to note, that a lot of senior leaders can't quote their core values. So that's the model that we use, and it's really saying, people want to know what they're expected to do and why. They want to have the skills, the information, the encouragement to execute. They want to have a sense of ownership. They also want to be proactive and looking beyond, which comes back to the points that you make. They want some learning opportunities, and they want to coordinate across the boundaries to eliminate the silos, because your customers won't understand the boundaries that you've created. And they want leaders that set those expectations and then model them. So, I invite you all, if we were measuring your culture, where might you be? Where might you be? Where you see white space, that means we've got less clarity and alignment. We've benchmarked this against 1,000 organisations in the database. That's 750,000 respondents, and the figures you see are percentiles. So on that 14 for core values, then 86% of the companies on the benchmark would be more clear and aligned than this particular example. So I wonder where you might be if you were going to measure your culture. Does it matter? Does it really connect to performance? I have lots of leaders that say, that's interesting, Karen, but actually I've got work to do and I've got business to get on and do. Well, your culture is your business. It's a way of implementing your strategy. It will either inhibit that or it will make that a much easier, more efficient process. This was the Dreams manufacturer and retailer of the beds. But actually, it's amazing the impact they had in just a year, 2014 to 2015. It was a turnaround leadership team, and they were out in the vans listening to their teams, the chief exec and the HR director. And within a year, they had a tremendous impact on the business. They used the culture diagnostic to create different conversations, and they did publicly ask a few of their senior leaders to leave. They didn't do the polite, they're going to have more time with their family. They were very clear that these senior leaders are leaving because there's a disconnect. And they built trust. And people began to believe that actually the dialogue is real, it's consistent, and the leaders were modeling that process. So it is about business. I always say to clients, map your strategy, your strategic objectives and aspirations onto this model, put your baseline in the middle, and then work out where your disconnects are that are really going to be most significant. And then we begin to drill down into some further details. The circumplex is just the pattern. but we begin to kind of say, okay, where's the synergy, where's the discrepancies? We segment the data across functions or teams, gender, level. Level is always essential. Where does the colour begin to fail? Because generally most of the colour sits with the senior leaders, and you begin to see where it begins to dissipate. And we can just start to have a much more specific, focused and structured conversation. If you don't measure culture, it's too nebulous to begin to know where to start. And the journey has to be focused and very specific. So I'm not going to have time to... do people get these slides as a reference? No. Yes. So the slides will be out there. I generally tend to share my curiosities with the client. I hate calling myself an expert in culture. Business owners are their own expert in their own culture. I'm a facilitator, and I will do that challenge and prodding. So there are some really lovely curiosities that we can begin to have. We can begin to have those conversations consistently across the business, and we can begin to collate the issues that are emerging that need to be dealt with most importantly. And then, fascinating. Here's an example of the data across levels. You'll notice that level 0 is the top leadership team. Okay. Generally, the top leadership team have more colour, and you could kind of say, well, it would be a bit worrying if they didn't, because they may feel that they're really clear on these things. But the challenge is, already you can see in this example, their next level, their direct reports, N1, have a very different opinion. So we can begin to say, okay, what's happening between the top senior leaders and your direct reports? The level 1 are actually doing a much better job at translating that down through the business. And we can, a really interesting point here on under empowerment. Business planning is ongoing and involves everyone in the process to some degree. It was on the 40th percentile overall, but actually that's all coming from the senior leaders. Nobody else feels included or involved in the business planning. So what might those leaders be missing if they're not hearing the opinions of those people closest to the business? So we can begin to drill that down and begin to have some very focused and specific conversations. Culture is really about habits, rituals and routines. You all have them that get you out of your front door when we used to do that on a regular basis on time. So, what are the good old habits in your business that you want to preserve and strengthen? Absolutely. Most people hate change because they kind of feel that nothing's being recognised for being successful in the first place. What are the good old habits that you want to preserve and strengthen? What are the bad old habits that you need to unlearn and leave behind? And that's not easy. What got us here today won't get us here tomorrow. What's the good new habits that you want to invent and perfect because you haven't got them yet? Once you test them out and you get them right, they become a good old habit. And what are you doing that's a bad new habit? And people say, why would you have a bad new habit? Well, you started something, but it's not quite having the impact that you hoped. So what might you need to rethink and try again? And finally, we've already done some research on 160 organisations that have done a cultural diagnostic, and they have also done the trust module, which was a kind of an innovation for us because clients were saying, we want to look at trust, we want to look at commitment, we want to look at engagement. So we know from our general research from those companies that the general drivers of trust are empowerment. How do we share information? How do we involve people in the business planning? How do we get that sense of ownership? Agreement. How do we really, have a clear pathway to have that conflict on the table and addressed? And capability development. How do we get people? How do we see that having capable people is going to give us a competitive advantage in the workplace? Thank you. I'm done.